Just give it a minute or so. Right, welcome everybody to our next session. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. Just a reminder to please complete the poll at the end of the session to rate the presentation. It's really, really important. Also, in the discuss section, please, we want you to be part of the engagement. If you have any thoughts, want to share, or any questions, please fill them in the chat box. That would be great. So I am very privileged to be chairing this session today and to welcome our two international speakers out of Chicago and Maryland, Washington. Welcome, ladies. I know it's early mornings, so we really appreciate you being here today. Our topic today is creating equity for all in sustainable and responsible supply chains. And with purpose as the North Star and the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a roadmap for sustainable supply chains, join two of IBM's senior sustainability leaders to discuss how equity for all brings clarity beyond net zero ambitions that is responsible, transparent, equitable, regenerative, and profitable. That's quite an ask, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that is accomplished. Just to give you a bit of background about Sheri and Sarah. With regards, Sheri, colleagues and clients affectionately call her the supply chain queen. Absolutely love that title and very apt in Women's Month that we've been celebrating here in South Africa for August. She is recognized as 2021, 2020, and 2019 Supply and Demand Chain Executive Pro to Know, the People's Choice 2020 Global Women in Supply Chain Leader, Corporate Vision Excellence Reward recipient for 2020's Most Influential Leader in Supply Chain and Technology, and a trusted partner that companies consistently leverage for insights and unique point of views in supply chain, retail, manufacturing, sustainability development goals, leading with purpose, diversity as a business imperative, and change leadership in digital transformations. Sheri is a rebel, an eternal student who loves bringing out the best in people and building back better in supply chain transformations. She's made a career simplifying the complex, rethinking supply chain strategy and customer experience. She hosts a top podcast that evangelizes the future supply chain called the Supply Chain Revolution. Her vision is to change the world through shared purpose and sustainable supply chain circularity and building technology grounded in the principles of sustainable development. Amongst numerous credentials, Sheri holds a master's from Harvard University with emphasis in sustainability. Sarah is a transformation advisor with over 14 years of experience across supply chain process transformation, demand and supply planning, digital workflow, design and implementation, supply chain value creation, and operating model design. She has a Bachelor of Engineering from McGill University, as well as an MBA and Masters of Information Science, both from Boston University. From furniture manufacturing to personal care, Sarah has been instrumental in the creation of multiple workflow processes and implementations with a proven expertise in creating organizational structure. Sarah recently led the supply planning team of a personal care company through the COVID-19 crisis to review and revise demand signals, automatically update open POs, and optimize inventory and production for COVID-related constraints, achieving a 4% inventory reduction and maintained OTIF levels despite COVID supply chain uncertainties. So really a big warm welcome to both you, Sheri and Sarah, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And what wasn't in that introduction is that Sarah and I work together at IBM on the same team, and we are sisters in purpose. And we're so excited to be here today and share with you all a point of view around how we can create equity in responsible supply chains and make it real and share some of the work that we're doing with clients. Okay, so the number one question that we get asked lately, if you can, there you go, if you can advance to slide, is, what is a sustainable supply chain and why should I care? And when we think about the idea of a triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, and how this works together in the Venn diagram as shown on screen, what we start to tease out is what's at these intersections. And we start to think a lot about what's beyond a net zero transformation. Is that really enough? How do we create a more circular and regenerative economy? And the thing that really stands out about the SDGs, they represent a more global, interconnected, common vision that no matter where you sit in the world, you can mobilize and move forward and progress. And there's also this vast ocean of sustainability frameworks, which Sarah is going to talk a little bit about. But it's really at these intersections where we start to form the basis of what's responsible and transparent and also profitable. And when we think about sustainable supply chains, most folks typically think of SDGs 12, 13, 9, 17, and 6. And these goals align around partnerships and responsible production and consumption, the premise of being carbon responsible, creating green infrastructure and clean water. But what we found is that it's so much more than that. Sustainable supply chains can provide the type of credibility and manage risk strategically and also create healthy ecosystems that are just as much about transforming the lives of people and leaving no one behind. And this is what we're going to unpack today, humanizing the urgency of climate change and equity for all. And I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone who's watching right now, the digital divide by nature and the physicality of supply chains means that technology companies like IBM, where Sarah and I work, have to become that conduit for scale and impact. And that means providing data and insights and having the ability to actually influence change behavior, improve your performance. All of this to foster trust and love and reliance on network science for stewardship. Next slide, please.
So if you could, for a minute, envision with us a real revolution in how we transact as businesses. So if you could imagine being part of an organization where consumers feel like they make a difference when they buy your product, where you're increasing customer loyalty, where you maximize your sustainability ROI, and all these other things that make the entire ecosystem of partners in the value chain work together harmoniously. That's our vision for the future. And that's what we're making possible through the work that we're doing in supply chain sustainability, and a little bit about what we will be looking at today. So this is about getting your consumers excited. It's about connecting with your suppliers to the nth tier. It's about understanding your supply chain from end to end, and really creating a purpose-driven and a value-driven supply chain. So why is that so hard to get to? I think that part of the real issue is, we have very linear thinking in general, and these problems are very hard to face. We are not able to solve them by ourselves, and there hasn't been a lot of information on how does any company get it right. We have very few North Star companies we can look to and say this is best practice. And so what that means is we need to come together and figure out how to really address not just the environmental challenges, which are front and center in most conversations because of the climate crisis that a lot of us are seeing firsthand, but also the social and governance impact aspects of the ESG. So making sure that no one is left behind, making sure that our structures, our governmental structures and support structures are actually driving the change that we need to drive in the future.
So this is recent research out of IBM's Institute for Business Value. And what we found is that a lot of companies are aligning and they're reporting against some of those ESG related commitments. This is a lens specifically related to the SDGs. And as you read what's on screen, 48% of folks who were surveyed are using the SDGs around some of these climate and net zero transition commitments. But over half plan to use or frankly don't know where to get started. And if I just put my rebel hat on, there's no shortage of pledges right now happening. And I'm not going to call out any bad actors, but certainly, 2020 and 2021, we've seen record high temps. We've seen flood events that were supposed to happen, once in a century, and now they're happening every year. And we've also seen a lot of just social inequities highlighted and accelerated due to the COVID pandemic. So what I want to call out here is, how do we align across networks, as Sarah just teased out in the previous slide? How are we able to connect the last mile and the first mile in a supply chain? And when we double click on where these folks are focusing, about half of the organizations, as you can see, and we've teased out a couple customers on the far right, they're getting really clear on responsible production and consumption. And a lot of that is frankly, the consequential benefits of sustainability, where you're looking at lean optimization and some of those more classic supply chain value levers. We're also seeing the push to clean energy. But what's different this time is health and well-being. How do you create decent work? How do you create access for folks who are marginalized in a linear economy? And how do you partner for the most material issues to your businesses, your customers, your trading partners? And Unilever, Walmart, a couple call outs, these are IBM customers. These are folks who are actually reporting on their progress, and they've started to humanize that connection between green operations and stewardship and gender equity and zero hunger and access to education, and incorporating the S in ESG corporate reporting, which we find is often far behind some of the climate initiatives. Next slide, please. So in addition to folks setting their own goals, one thing that we see is folks are also uniting by industry vertical and other shared interests to collectively address some of the sustainability challenges. And you can read on screen, I'll just pull out a couple of threads in the interest of time. When we see the power of partnership and purpose and materiality, what ends up happening is, from this sustainability consortium, WBCSG, a lot of clients are looking at something called shared value creation. And this is across a broader ecosystem and defining, what does long-term success look like? And one thing that I think COVID has also highlighted is that operational excellence and some of those short-term performance gains are tied to long-term value creation. And you're seeing the connection between a business's success and its performance and the health of the communities that it serves, the health of the communities that really stand up their global supply chains. Next slide, please. So when you think about some of the climate imperatives, and again, a lot of folks in this space of that 48% and then that 20 to 25% underneath, they're pretty clear on where to focus. What you see on screen are 4 verticals, and we've just highlighted some of those key imperatives, not only through the Institute for Business Value research, but also through real-time client engagements that Sarah and I support. You see a lot of emphasis on regenerative agriculture. How can we make better choices? How can we empower smallholders and farmers and folks who stand up our supply base to understand that relationship between daily decisions, using technology, for example, weather data, geospatial data, to get really clear on optimal planting patterns. What combination will give the greatest yield, for example. And this all ties back to some of the raw material inflation, and it actually reinforces supply assurity upstream for big brands. We see a lot of focus around supplier compliance, which I think Sarah is going to double click on. And then, some of the manufacturing and distribution imperatives, this is not new to supply chain folks who are watching. But what I do want to pull out is the premise that we have designed impacts into our products and into our networks and into the way that we have iterated to lowest price. And when you think about that at 10,000 feet, without seeing through a life cycle approach, and that's highlighted a little bit in retailing, all of those impacts have been externalized traditionally onto trading partners, all the packaging, all the pollution, all of the things that we feel, we see it in the communities where we live. Brands are going to have to start being accountable for that total cost of ownership. And where that gate of responsibility is moving, it's changing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Next slide, please.
Absolutely. And I think, some of that change that we're seeing is in the people and work side of the SDGs. Sheri talked about the climate imperatives and supply chains, and what's often disregarded but is becoming really front and center more and more is the human rights portion of supply chains. As we saw from the summer of last year in the US, more recently in South Africa, there's a real impact on social inequality. And one of our big imperatives as supply chain practitioners is how do you close the gap in order to make a sustainable future for everyone going forward. We show here on this slide what that means across the supply chain, right? So for example, in CPG, from your suppliers who are the farmers, it's about helping them understand the rules and regulations they have to be compliant with. It's about reporting raw materials and social standards. It's about making sure that you're not using the farm and providing things like fertilizers that will make the soil not work going forward. And it's also about creating transparency. In manufacturing, it's about wage tracking. It's about how do you make sure everyone is safe on the floor, responsible partner sourcing, and then a safe and supportive work environment. In retailing, I'm just going to call out a couple of them here. We know a lot about ethical marketing and business practices, and a lot of the change in retailing is actually being driven by the consumer. The consumer is demanding a lot more visibility. Our consumers, the younger generation, is a lot more value focused than prior generations have been. And so a lot of the tracking, reporting, and brand integrity will be coming from what the consumer is demanding. Then finally, on the consumer side, it's about informing consumers on risk. It's making sure that we don't have anti-competitive behavior that negatively affects the consumer. And it's also about building community and investing back in communities. So one of the big things that we have to tackle, obviously, as citizens in Africa, I am a Kenyan citizen myself, and so part of this really speaks to me because of when I look at this, it's a view of corruption, a corruption index. This is from transparency.org, and it's a view of how bribery looks, and how bribery looks for very basic services like healthcare and education. The darker colors means, folks have paid a bribe over the past 12 months for very basic care and basic access to very basic services. I have a personal experience with this. I I was sharing with Sheri yesterday that when my sister passed away in 2016, I went to the morgue, and the person at the morgue asked me for a bribe to make sure that my sister's body was well taken care of in order for her to have a good viewing. So you think about an issue like that that's very personal and a place where you should not even be thinking about bribery, but it's so entrenched in society that it's something that we have to tackle as supply chain practitioners in terms of understanding how do we get this rooted out of our society as we think through equity for all and access for all. We don't have to have, consumers should not have to have all the money in the world in order to have access to basic human rights. And so part of what we should be tackling as supply chain practitioners is how do we change this? How do we change the dark brown and the dark red, even the orange, into something that's a lot more gray? And so I think as a, a SAPEX conference, this should be really front and center of what we're thinking of as we think of supply chain equity and transparency.
And just double clicking on this, when you think about, the promise of equity in the midst of disruption and also the COVID response, I mean, we're still living through this. I think there are 4 key themes that have emerged. And I promise we're going to take it back to supply chains in a second, but I think that this is really relevant to call out given the crises that are happening real time. Strengthening oversight of institutions. When you think about the resources to reach some of those who are in most need, that are subject to some of what Sarah's just covered, you really have to have oversight in institutions. And this is all around governance, making sure that there's sufficient funding, resources, and also independence for folks to perform duties. The other thing is what we found specifically in procurement is making sure that there's open and transparent contracting. In the midst of the COVID response, a lot of governments have actually relaxed these procurement processes. And what happens in this haste is the procedures can get very vague. And the process that we have to make sure that it's open and that folks have access to the right data, which is point 4 also, to make sure that we have insights into any wrongdoing, specifically around conflict of interest, and to ensure fair pricing and also fair living wage. Number 3 is all about, promoting a civic space, a space where folks can thrive, and a space where we can defend democracy. We really have to make sure that, groups and the media have to create a safe space that actually enable conditions to also hold governments and bad actors accountable. And I think that that's also, as Sarah just mentioned on the previous slide, the COVID-19 crisis has actually shined a light on the democratic decline, especially in Africa, and other markets around the world. And then lastly, this is also very much a data and access issue, as we're finding when you just see the sheer amount of disaggregated data spend and the distribution of resources, especially in risk response, emergency response situations. Folks that are already marginalized and left behind typically suffer the worst scenario in this case. So we need to make sure that governments have access to timely, meaningful information that guarantee rights, human rights, and equity to the communities that they serve. Next slide, please.
And so what are we seeing coming down the pike in terms of regulation? What we're seeing is Europe is really leading the way in regulations. You see at the top what kind of regulations have come forward, including TCFD, which was the latest one in 2017. But we have firms in the UK by 2021. The UK will be under BOE, Prudential Regulation Authority. There's a plastics tax coming out in 2022 in the UK. by 2025, TCFD will be mandatory across the entire UK economy. And there are a number of other regulations that have come forward, specifically in Europe, that are tackling some of the major issues that we're talking about. One that I see not highlighted here is Germany's Supply Chain Transparency Act that just came out this year. But what we expect on the horizon is a lot of cascading of these regulations to a global scale. And we see it as a good thing. There'll be bold requirements to be transparent, to be compliant, and to be responsible. And so our job as supply chain practitioners, as we see it, is to get ready for what is coming down the pike to be mandated, but to proactively act so that we're actually making sure that we have embedded ESGs throughout our supply chain and throughout the value chains that we operate in.
And when we think about what this looks like, you know, like I said in the earlier slides, we hear a lot about net zero and decarbonization, but what we need most to create equity for all is going beyond some of this classic footprint. We need to think about the impact and the handprints in the world that we share. And what you see on screen is an evolution. You see some of the traditional financial reporting. And this is where a lot of folks are. Maybe they've tapped into integrated ESG performance frameworks. They kind of understand risk. Maybe they've done the materiality assessment. And maybe they're moving more towards stakeholder capitalism. But what we often find is people have these really big, bold ambitions around the sustainable development goals. In ESG, there's no calibration. It may sit in a part of the organization. You know, SDG sits maybe with the CSO or with the strategy, a strategy leader in organization, and there's a big disconnect. What we are helping clients do is move to impact. And that's the third pillar here, through the Value Balancing Alliance, where you really start to understand the impact of change behavior. And you understand, you know, what's the social cost of carbon? How can we, through creating really great tri-sector partnerships that are going to create access and conduits for upskilling in the future of work, for Clean Water Initiative, what's that impact in society, on communities, and how does business help leave no one behind? Next slide, please.
So we help clients in the practice that Sheri and I are in. We help clients get really clear on what does that mean for your supply chain. What you're seeing on the left is what we call the green compass. And it's a visual view of how we look at sustainability in the enterprise. So throughout the entire supply chain and including in finance, we have done a lot of work in terms of helping clients get clear on what does embedding sustainability into your supply chain look like? How do you start the journey? Or if you've started the journey already, how do you keep improving on getting really clear on your ESG goals, measuring them, sustaining KPIs, and making sure that you're meeting your targets. And so if you want to reach out to us after this meeting, please feel free to. I believe that the moderators will be sharing our email addresses, but we're also on LinkedIn. And we're really happy to engage in this. I feel kind of like a geek when I start talking about this. So really excited to talk to anyone who wants to engage around what we've been doing. And then also about IBM's 50-year journey in sustainability. IBM has been a very big leader on climate action, on social responsibility, on inclusivity and diversity. And so we certainly have a lot of internal lessons that we can share with the team. Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Sheri?
No, I think it's beautifully said, and certainly I know we have a couple use cases, Cindy, and we probably won't have time to get through all of them, but I did just want to give a flavor of, you know, where all of these things that we've just unpacked, where it intersects. And this is a great use case around the plastic bank. When you think about empowering collectors, and then also that overlay with a circular, sustainable supply chain. This is a great example. And we don't have to read through the entire thing, but when you think about, the reuse economy, giving folks a way to earn a living, and then this also is a great program because it creates access for upskilling and education. There's an entire program that's not shown on this slide, but the tokenization of waste and making sure that when we create networks and when we think about what economies look like over the next 10 to 50 years, we're actually thinking about ways that we can use what we have on Earth right now to empower others and create financial inclusion. We also have, if you go to the next slide, a really great story around Farmer Connect. This has been highlighted on the Supply Chain Revolution podcast, where you can actually, using a QR code, and this ties in not only traceability, consumer sustainability, but connecting that last mile to the first mile. And that was something that we pulled on earlier in the presentation, being able to scan a QR code on a bag of coffee and right at your fingertips, you're able to see the journey of that bean all the way back to the community, the farmer. You can thank your farmer in-app. You can even tip your farmer, and you can donate toward a community-based sustainable development goal. And this is sort of, I get goosebumps when I talk about it, because this is the type of world that the circular economy can enable, and that just thinking about things differently can enable, and making those connections where they haven't been available or accessible before in the world that we share. And I think we're at time. But Sarah, do you want to talk a little about Carrefour, or do we have questions?
You still have got about 5 minutes or so.
Oh,
wonderful.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, I think just in line with what Sheri was saying, we also have a Carrefour case study. I believe Carrefour is in South Africa, but for those who might not be in South Africa, this is a grocery chain that IBM worked with. And this case is about how consumers really were demanding more information on where their food came from and how Carrefour built a lot of brand equity and increased profitability through being able to trace their food back to its source. So through the IBM Food Trust, which is powered by blockchain, you're able to scan a QR code on packaging, very similar to the case that Sheri just talked about, and learn about the brand that you're buying, specifically for chicken, what the origin was, the feed, the antibiotic use. And what this really created for Carrefour was what consumers saw as a lot of transparency and trust. And so there's a huge outcome on brand equity. And so, contrary to popular belief that sustainability can be very costly, sustainability can also be a huge, huge top line growth engine. And so I think that was really what we wanted to share today, but really happy to take questions and talk more broadly about anything that we might want to cover.
Whoa, look at that.
Yeah.
On your screen. I want to give a shout out to Zanola and Eduardo and Nikita and Pranita. Thank you so much. I see you're in the chat, and I'm trying to not multitask because I get distracted. But I want to wave and say hello. I know, especially Zanola and Eduardo. It's a pleasure to see you there.
Ladies, thank you so much. What a powerful presentation. And I think some of the key takeouts for me is just this power of partnership and purpose. I mean, it's so important. We talk about collaboration so often in this industry, but to have that power of that partnership and purpose is really critical. The shared value creation, that's also extremely important. And, that we're measuring beyond footprint. I really like that statement. I think everyone's so concerned about, getting your baseline done and ticking all the boxes with reporting. They don't often look to the greater benefits of measuring beyond your footprint. And really, those are phenomenal takeouts that came out of this presentation, amongst many. So we don't have too many questions here, but I really just want to thank you again for sharing your insights with us and for waking up early to be part of it, and that we're really privileged to have had you here on our SupplyX Forum. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Hope to see everyone in person when things open up. Miss Jenny has promised.
That would be awesome.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Don't forget to go into the poll, please, and rate the presentations. Thank you.